What is this about? Who are you looking for?
You know who we're looking
I'm innocent! You got the wrong person!
The Tuesday afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt of the residential street, making the air shimmer above the parked cars. It was the kind of lazy heat that made you want to stay inside, but Keisha Johnson stood on the sidewalk, watching the tow truck driver methodically prepare to hoist her sedan. The vehicle seizure was an irritating but manageable problem, a dispute over a repair bill that had spiraled into a lien. It was frustrating, but it was just property. She'd sort it out. The important thing was to handle it correctly, by the book. The tow truck driver, a portly man named Gus with sweat stains darkening his blue work shirt, was professional enough, going about his business with a detached air. He'd shown her the paperwork, and while she disagreed with the garage's claim, the court order was legitimate. There was no point in arguing with him. Keisha pulled out her phone. "Hey, Auntie May," she said, her voice calm and even. "Yeah, I'm over on Elm Street. They're towing the car. No, everything's fine. I just wanted someone else to be here, you know, to see it happen. Can you and Marcus swing by? Just for a few minutes. I just want a witness, that's all." It was a simple precaution. In her line of work, she knew how quickly situations could be misconstrued, how narratives could be twisted. A couple of extra sets of eyes were always a good insurance policy. She ended the call and gave Gus a small, reassuring nod. "My family's just coming to watch," she said. "No trouble." Gus just grunted, focused on securing the chains to the car's undercarriage. A police cruiser rolled to a stop a few feet away. The officer who emerged was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern face and weary eyes that seemed to take in the scene with immediate suspicion. He was probably in his late 40s, his uniform crisp despite the heat. His name tag read, J. Carter. Officer James Carter didn't approach Gus or Keisha with a question. He approached with an air of authority looking for a challenge. His eyes swept over Keisha, lingered on her phone still in her hand, and then moved to the tow truck. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the quiet afternoon. "Good afternoon, officer," Keisha said, her tone respectful but firm. She was trained to de-escalate, to project calm. "It's a civil matter, a vehicle seizure. Everything's in order." She gestured toward the paperwork Gus had placed on the dashboard of her car. Carter barely glanced at it. His focus remained locked on her. "You got ID?" he asked. "This your vehicle?" "Yes, it is," Keisha replied, reaching slowly for her purse. "My ID is in here." The very act of reaching for her bag felt charged under his intense gaze. He watched her every move as if expecting her to pull a weapon instead of a wallet. Just then, a familiar SUV pulled up to the curb behind the cruiser. Her Aunt May, a woman whose presence was usually a source of comfort, looked out with a worried expression. Her cousin Marcus, a young man in his early 20s with a nervous energy about him, got out of the passenger side. "Keisha, you okay?" Marcus called out, his voice betraying his anxiety. He saw the officer and immediately seemed to shrink, his hands going into his pockets. Officer Carter's head snapped toward the newcomers. His posture stiffened, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the butt of his service weapon. He saw two more black people arriving at what he had already framed in his mind as a situation. He didn't see family. He saw a threat. "Who's this?" Carter barked, turning his glare from Keisha to Marcus. "Stay back! Stay right there!" The atmosphere shifted instantly. The oppressive heat suddenly felt charged with a different kind of energy, tense, volatile, and dangerous. The mundane annoyance of a car being towed was rapidly dissolving into something else entirely. Keisha could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't about the car anymore. Carter's perception of the scene was so fundamentally warped, so disconnected from the reality of a woman simply asking her family to be present for a civil procedure, that it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She had invited them for transparency, but in Officer Carter's eyes, she had just called for backup. The simple vehicle seizure was no longer simple. It was becoming a crucible, and the heat was rising. Keisha's calm began to feel like a fragile shield against a storm she hadn't seen coming, a storm embodied by the officer standing before her, his mind already made up. The chaos was just beginning to stir. "That's my aunt and my cousin, officer," Keisha stated, keeping her voice as steady as she could. She held up her hands in a placating gesture, palms open. "I asked them to come. I just wanted them to witness the towing process, that's all." She tried to inject a sense of reasonableness into her tone to bridge the chasm of suspicion that Carter had opened. But her words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall of hostility. Carter's eyes narrowed, flickering between Keisha, Marcus, and Aunt May, who was now cautiously stepping out of the SUV. He was calculating, connecting dots that weren't there, building a narrative of conspiracy and confrontation. "You called them down here to interfere?" Carter accused, taking a step closer to Keisha. His physical presence was intimidating, clearly meant to be. He was using his size and his uniform to dominate the space, to shrink her world down to the few feet of concrete she stood on. "I called them to observe, officer," Keisha corrected gently. "There's a difference. This is my property being taken. I have a right to have my family present." She was careful with her words, choosing them with the precision of a bomb technician. She knew that any perceived defiance, any hint of an attitude, would be used as justification for whatever he decided to do next. She was asserting a right, not issuing a challenge. Aunt May, a woman who had navigated her share of injustice with a quiet, unshakable dignity, spoke up from the sidewalk. "We're just here for Keisha, officer. We're not here to cause any problems." Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of a matriarch. It was a plea for peace, an appeal to common sense. But Carter wasn't interested in peace. He seemed to thrive on the conflict he was creating. He turned to Aunt May, pointing a finger at her. "You need to stay in your vehicle or on the sidewalk. Don't come any closer." He was drawing lines, establishing a perimeter, treating a quiet suburban street like a riot scene. Marcus, meanwhile, was a bundle of raw nerves. He stood frozen by the SUV, his eyes wide, darting from Carter to Keisha and back again. He understood the unspoken language of this kind of encounter far better than his aunt did. He knew that a black man's anxiety in the presence of a police officer could be interpreted as guilt, his fear as aggression. He was trying to make himself as small and non-threatening as possible. But in Carter's world, his very existence was a provocation. "I just need you to understand my position, officer," Keisha tried again, her patience wearing thin but her training holding strong. "This whole situation with the garage has been difficult. I wanted to make sure everything was documented, that there were witnesses to how my property was handled. It's about accountability. It's about transparency." She was explaining her motives, laying them bare, hoping he would see the logic, the simple human desire not to be taken advantage of. She was speaking the truth, but Carter heard only excuses. He heard a woman who was talking too much, who wasn't showing the proper level of deference he felt he was owed. "The only thing you need to understand," Carter retorted, his voice dripping with condescension, "is that I am in charge of this scene. The tow truck driver is doing his job, and you are starting to obstruct it by creating a spectacle." The accusation was absurd. The spectacle consisted of two family members standing quietly 20 feet away. The only person creating tension was Carter himself. He was the one who had introduced aggression into the equation. Keisha's act of caution, her call for the simple comfort and security of family, had been twisted into something sinister. It was a classic case of projective inversion. He was accusing her of the very disruption he was causing. The call for transparency was being reframed as an incitement to riot. She felt a profound sense of helplessness as she watched him build a case against her out of thin air, using her own reasonable actions as the bricks and his prejudice as the mortar. She wanted witnesses, and now, ironically, her witnesses were being used as evidence of her supposed intent to cause trouble. Officer Carter's perception of the scene was now fully solidified. In his mind, this was no longer a civil matter he had stumbled upon. It was a coordinated effort to challenge police authority. Keisha's calm explanations, Aunt May's peaceful presence, and Marcus's nervous stillness were not data points to be assessed. They were pieces of a puzzle that, in his biased view, spelled defiance. He squared his shoulders and puffed out his chest, a physical manifestation of his escalating internal state. He was a hammer, and everything around him was starting to look like a nail. "I asked for your ID," he said, turning his full attention back to Keisha, his voice now devoid of any pretense of procedural correctness. It was a pure, unadulterated command. "Now!" Keisha complied, moving with deliberate slowness. She opened her purse and retrieved her wallet, her fingers feeling clumsy under his unblinking stare. She knew that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted, used as a pretext. She handed him her driver's license. He snatched it from her hand and examined it, his eyes flicking from the photo to her face. "Keisha Johnson," he read aloud, almost as if it were an indictment. He held on to the license, not returning it, tucking it into his shirt pocket. It was a small act of dominance, a way of holding a piece of her identity hostage. He then turned his attention to Marcus, who was still trying to blend in with the scenery by the SUV. "You! What's your name?" Carter shouted across the short distance. Marcus flinched as if struck. Marcus," he stammered. "Marcus Jones." "You got ID on you, Marcus Jones?" Carter demanded. Marcus nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled for his wallet. He was terrified. He'd seen videos online, heard stories from friends. He knew how quickly a situation like this could spiral, how a routine question could lead to a chokehold. The fear was palpable, a scent in the air that seemed to embolden Carter. "Walk it over to me, slowly," Carter commanded, as if directing a suspect in a felony stop. Marcus began to walk forward, his steps hesitant. He held his wallet out in front of him, a peace offering. Aunt May, seeing her nephew's distress, took a step forward. "He's just a boy, officer. He hasn't done anything." Carter whirled on her, his face a mask of fury. "I told you to stay back. One more word out of you and you'll be in cuffs for obstruction. Do you understand me?" His threat hung in the hot, still air. Aunt May froze, her face a mixture of shock and fear. She was a church-going woman in her 60s, and she was being threatened with arrest for trying to comfort her nephew. This was the core of Carter's strategy: isolate, intimidate, and dominate. He was systematically dismantling Keisha's small support system, turning her family from a source of comfort into a source of liability. He was making it clear that their presence would only make things worse for her. Keisha watched, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She had seen this kind of officer before, the kind who manufactured chaos and then blamed others for the fallout. His ego was a fragile, brittle thing, and he perceived any questioning of his absolute authority as a personal attack. Her request for transparency had been an affront to him, a suggestion that his presence wasn't enough to guarantee fairness. He was now punishing her for that perceived slight. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Keisha said, her voice low but firm. "My cousin has done nothing wrong. My aunt has done nothing wrong. We are cooperating." "Cooperating?" Carter scoffed, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "This doesn't look like cooperation to me. This looks like a setup. You call your people down here to try and intimidate me? You think I haven't seen this before?" He was projecting his own aggression onto them, painting them as the aggressors. He was the one who had brought hostility to the scene, yet he was framing himself as the victim of their supposed intimidation. It was a masterful, if terrifying, display of psychological manipulation. The air crackled with unspoken violence. The tow truck driver, Gus, had stopped his work, now standing by his truck, a silent, uneasy observer of a situation that had gone far beyond a simple vehicle impound. The initial problem of the towed car had become a footnote to a much more dangerous and unpredictable conflict, one orchestrated entirely by Officer James Carter's brittle sense of authority. The tension on the street had become a physical entity, thick and suffocating. Every breath felt shallow. Marcus stood halfway between the SUV and Officer Carter, his wallet held out, his body trembling. Carter's eyes were locked on him, a predator sizing up its prey. The officer's aggression was a relentless, oppressive force, and Marcus was at its epicenter. For a young black man, a police encounter is never neutral territory. It is a minefield of potential missteps where the consequences can be catastrophic. Marcus was navigating that minefield, and he was losing his footing. "I said walk it over here," Carter repeated, his voice dangerously low. "What are you waiting for?" Marcus took another hesitant step, but then his eyes darted to Keisha, then to his mother, Aunt May, who looked helpless and terrified. He saw the rage in Carter's face, the unyielding hostility. In that split second, his survival instincts screamed louder than any rational thought. The primal urge to flee, to escape the immediate threat, overwhelmed the logical understanding that running would only make things worse. His mind wasn't processing legal strategy. It was processing imminent danger, fight or flight. And he wasn't a fighter. With a sudden panicked gasp, Marcus turned and bolted. He didn't run towards the car or his mother. He sprinted down the sidewalk, away from the cruiser, away from Officer Carter, away from the entire volatile scene. It was a pure, instinctual act of self-preservation, a desperate gamble to escape a situation that felt utterly without hope. "Hey, get back here!" Carter roared. For a moment, he looked like he might give chase, but he was a big man and Marcus was young and fast. Instead, Carter's fury, denied its immediate target, recoiled like a snake and struck at the next closest thing. Keisha. He whirled around to face her, his face contorted with rage. "See? See what you did?" he screamed, his finger jabbing at the air in the direction Marcus had fled. "You brought him here to cause trouble, and now he's running! He's probably got warrants! You're harboring a fugitive!" The accusations were wild, baseless, and instantaneous. In Carter's mind, Marcus's flight was not the act of a scared young man. It was definitive proof of guilt, and by extension, proof of Keisha's malevolent intent. He had his narrative, and every event was now being forcibly crammed into it. Marcus's desperate flight had inadvertently sealed Keisha's fate. It was the proof Carter needed to justify his aggression. "He was scared!" Keisha yelled back, her composure finally shattering. The injustice of it was a physical blow. "You scared him! You threatened him! You threatened my aunt! He ran because he was afraid of you!" Her voice was filled with a righteous anger that had been simmering beneath her calm exterior. But to Carter, her anger was just more confirmation of her guilt. He saw it as defiance, as the aggressive behavior he had been expecting all along. "Now you're going to tell me how to do my job?" he sneered. "I'm done with this. You're obstructing my investigation." Aunt May let out a sob. "He's just a boy," she whispered again, this time to herself, her face buried in her hands. The scene had devolved into utter chaos. The tow truck driver was now slowly backing away, wanting no part of what was unfolding. The quiet suburban street was now a stage for a drama of prejudice and power. Keisha felt a profound sense of despair. She had done everything right. She had been calm, respectful, and had clearly stated her intentions. But none of that mattered. The facts didn't matter. Her character didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was Officer Carter's perception, a lens warped by bias and a hunger for control. Marcus's flight had been the spark, but Carter had built the pyre and soaked it in gasoline. Now, he was ready to light the match. The entire weight of the situation, the blame for Marcus's fear and the chaos that ensued, had been transferred squarely onto her shoulders. She was no longer a citizen exercising her rights. She was a suspect, an accomplice, the architect of a crime that had never even been committed. "Turn around, put your hands behind your back," Officer Carter commanded. The words were cold, final. There was no room for discussion, no space for appeal. Keisha stood frozen for a second, the command echoing in the superheated air. This couldn't be happening. She was the victim of his aggression, yet she was being treated as the perpetrator. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "I haven't done anything." "Obstruction of justice, inciting a disturbance, aiding a fleeing suspect." Carter rattled off the charges as if he were reading from a script he had long since memorized. Each accusation was a fabrication, a gross distortion of the afternoon's events. He was building his legal fortress on a foundation of lies. Your cousin running just confirmed it all. This was a setup from the start. Now turn around or I will put you on the ground. The threat was explicit. He was ready, even eager, for this to become physical. He wanted her to resist. It would complete his perfect, twisted narrative. Aunt May cried out, "No!" "Keisha, don't say anything. Just do what he says." Her voice was fraught with a lifetime of learned experience, the painful knowledge that in moments like these, survival often meant submission. Keisha looked at her aunt's terrified face and something inside her acquiesced. Arguing further was pointless. He was not an officer of the law seeking truth. He was an aggressor seeking validation. Any further resistance would only endanger her more. With a deep, shuddering breath, Keisha slowly turned around, presenting her back to him. The gesture was one of reluctant compliance, not guilt. It felt like a profound violation, a surrender to a monstrous injustice. The metallic rasp of the handcuffs being unclipped from Carter's belt was unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He grabbed her left wrist with a roughness that was entirely unnecessary, twisting her arm behind her back. He did the same with her right, his movements jerky and filled with anger. Then came the cold, definitive click as the steel jaws of the first cuff locked around her wrist, followed by a second click. The sound was so final, so absolute. It was the sound of her rights vanishing, the sound of his narrative winning. In that moment, she was no longer Keisha Johnson, a citizen with a grievance. She was a prisoner, a number, a body in the custody of the state. "You're making a mistake, officer," she said, her voice muffled as she faced the street. "A very big mistake." "Tell it to the judge," Carter grunted, yanking the cuffs to ensure they were tight, digging the metal into her skin. He then placed a heavy hand on the back of her neck and began to march her toward the patrol car. "Don't touch me," she said, trying to shrug off his hand, a last futile act of defiance. "I'm walking." "You'll do as you're told," he snarled, pushing her forward. He opened the back door of the cruiser and shoved her inside. The back seat was hard plastic, molded for discomfort and easy cleaning. The air inside the car was stifling, thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing her in. Through the window and the metal grate, she could see her Aunt May weeping on the sidewalk. She could see Gus, the tow truck driver, shaking his head slowly before finally turning back to his work, his face a mask of weary resignation. He was now just a witness to an arrest, his simple job having become a part of a police report. Keisha leaned her head against the hot glass of the window, the world outside suddenly distant and distorted. She had been handcuffed for a crime she didn't commit. She had been arrested for calling her family, for wanting a witness, for daring to believe that transparency could protect her. The irony was suffocating. In her attempt to ensure her encounter with the system was fair and documented, she had triggered a violent and unjust response from that very system. Her story, which had started as a simple effort to protect her property, had now become a desperate struggle to reclaim her own freedom and expose the truth behind an arrest built on nothing but a police officer's prejudice. The precinct was a whirlwind of noise and impersonal procedure. Keisha was processed like any other arrestee, fingerprinted, photographed, her belongings cataloged and sealed in a plastic bag. The officers who handled her were detached, their movements practiced and disinterested. To them, she was just another file, another body to move through the system. The presumption of innocence felt like a distant academic concept, completely absent from the cold reality of the station. After the processing, she was led down a long, sterile hallway to a small, windowless room. The interrogation room. It contained nothing but a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. The air was cold, a stark contrast to the heat outside, and the walls were a dull, institutional gray. The glare from the fluorescent lights overhead was harsh and unforgiving. 2 detectives entered the room. They were older than Carter, their faces etched with the cynicism of their profession. The lead detective, a man named Miller, was tall and thin with a perpetual scowl. His partner, Detective Rossi, was shorter, stockier, and had a calmer, more measured demeanor, though his eyes were just as sharp. They didn't introduce themselves with any warmth. Miller dropped a thin file folder onto the table. It slid across the surface and stopped in front of Keisha. "Keisha Johnson," Miller began, his voice flat. "You're in a whole lot of trouble. Officer Carter's report says you incited a disturbance, obstructed a lawful seizure, and that your accomplice fled the scene, likely because he had outstanding warrants." Keisha listened, her anger simmering beneath a layer of forced calm. "Every part of that statement is false," she said, her voice even. "I called my family to witness the seizure for my own protection and for transparency. Officer Carter arrived and immediately escalated the situation. He threatened my aunt and terrified my cousin. My cousin Marcus is a college student with no record. He ran because Officer Carter was aggressive and threatening. He was scared for his life." She laid out the facts simply, clearly, without embellishment. It was the truth. It should have been enough. Rossi leaned forward, adopting a posture of reason and understanding. It was a classic interrogation tactic. Good cop, bad cop. "Look, Keisha," he said, his voice softer than Miller's. "We've been doing this a long time. We see this kind of thing happen. A situation gets tense, people get scared, things get out of hand. But Officer Carter is a veteran officer. His report is very detailed. He says you were confrontational from the moment he arrived, questioning his authority, gathering a crowd." "A crowd?" Keisha repeated, her disbelief palpable. "It was my 65-year-old aunt and my 20-year-old cousin. That's not a crowd, that's family. I was not confrontational. I was assertive. I know my rights." Miller scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Ah, there it is. I know my rights. That's usually what we hear right before someone resists arrest." He was twisting her knowledge of her own civil liberties into an admission of guilt. In his worldview, a good citizen didn't need to know their rights. They just needed to comply. The interrogation continued in this vein for over an hour. They circled the same points again and again. Her explanations were dismissed as lies, her perspective completely invalidated. They were not seeking the truth. They were seeking a confession. They wanted her to validate Carter's report, to admit that she had been unruly, that she had provoked the incident. They wanted her to accept the narrative that had been written for her the moment Carter laid eyes on her. "Where's your cousin now?" Miller asked abruptly. "I imagine he's at home terrified," Keisha shot back. "Why don't you send a car to talk to him? Talk to my aunt. Talk to the tow truck driver. His name is Gus. He saw everything." "We'll talk to everyone we need to," Miller said dismissively. "But right now we're talking to you, and your story just isn't adding up. An innocent person doesn't need to call for backup for a routine car tow." "It wasn't backup. It was support," Keisha insisted, her voice rising in frustration. She slammed her hand on the table. "How can you not see the difference?" Miller smiled, a cold, triumphant little smile. He looked at Rossi. "She's getting agitated," he said, as if she were a specimen under a microscope. "Just like Carter said she was." They had what they wanted. They had provoked a reaction, a flash of the anger and frustration that any innocent person would feel in her situation, and they were logging it as evidence of her supposed volatility. The cold glare of the interrogation room lights felt like an indictment. The room was designed to make you feel small, isolated, and powerless. Keisha realized with a sinking heart that the truth was irrelevant here. The only thing that mattered was the story the police department wanted to tell, and she was being cast as the villain. After the interrogation, Keisha was taken to a holding cell. The heavy metal door clanged shut, the sound echoing the finality of the interrogation. The cell was small and smelled of bleach and despair. There was a concrete bench and a toilet in the corner. For the first time since the ordeal began, Keisha was truly alone with her thoughts, and the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She was an undercover police agent, a highly trained and decorated officer from the Metro Division's Internal Affairs Unit, currently on a long-term assignment investigating corruption in suburban precincts. This was not part of the plan. Her cover was deep, her new identity meticulously crafted. To the world, she was Keisha Johnson, a freelance graphic designer. Revealing her true identity now would compromise a year-long investigation. But sitting in this cell, facing fabricated charges, what choice did she have? Hours passed. The initial adrenaline gave way to a bone-deep weariness. She replayed the encounter with Carter in her head, analyzing every word, every gesture. She hadn't made a mistake. She had followed her training for de-escalation, even as a civilian. The fault lay entirely with Carter's prejudice and aggression. But the system was designed to protect its own. Carter's word against hers. A veteran officer against a black woman he'd painted as an agitator. She knew how that usually ended. Late in the evening, the latch on her cell door scraped open. She looked up, expecting a guard with a tray of unappetizing food. Instead, a different figure stood there. He was a sergeant, his uniform adorned with stripes that spoke of a long career. He looked to be in his late 50s, with kind eyes that held a hint of skepticism. His name tag read, Sergeant Davis. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice quiet, respectful. "I'm the watch commander tonight. I've been reviewing your case file. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Keisha was wary, but something about his demeanor was different from the aggressive certainty of Carter and the dismissive arrogance of the detectives. She simply nodded. Sergeant Davis didn't enter the cell, but stood in the doorway. "I read Officer Carter's report. I read the summary from Detectives Miller and Rossi. Then I read the initial incident report. There are a few things that don't quite line up for me." He paused, looking at her intently. "Carter's report states you were screaming and belligerent from the outset. But the tow company's dispatcher, whom we called for a statement, said that when their driver, Gus, called in to confirm the seizure, he mentioned you were calm and cooperative. Those were his exact words." This was the first crack in the official story, the first piece of external evidence that contradicted Carter's narrative. A small, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in Keisha's chest. "He also states your cousin Marcus Jones fled to evade arrest for outstanding warrants," Davis continued, his gaze unwavering. "We ran Mr. Jones's name. He has no warrants, no criminal record whatsoever, not even a speeding ticket. He's a junior at the state university on the dean's list." Keisha remained silent, letting him talk. He was discovering the truth on his own, and it was far more powerful than anything she could say at this point. "The thing that really bothers me," Sergeant Davis said, lowering his voice slightly, "is the charge of inciting a disturbance. A disturbance requires, well, a disturbance. But by all accounts, except for Officer Carter's, the scene was quiet until he began shouting. He claims your family was a hostile crowd. His own body camera will have been activated. That footage will be very illuminating, I expect." He looked at her, and for the first time she felt seen not as a suspect, but as a person. "I've been a cop for 30 years, Ms. Johnson," he said softly. "I've seen good arrests and I've seen bad ones. This one has a bad smell to it. I've flagged the file for formal review by my captain and by Internal Affairs. I'm not making any promises, but I'm telling you this isn't going to just be rubber-stamped." He gave a slight nod and turned to leave. The heavy door closed again, but this time, the silence didn't feel so oppressive. Sergeant Davis was a seasoned officer, an old-school cop who still believed in doing the job right. He had spotted the inconsistencies, the telltale signs of a bad arrest and a falsified report. He had planted the first seed of doubt within the department's walls. It was only a glimmer, but in the suffocating darkness of her holding cell, that glimmer of hope felt as bright as the sun. The morning after her arrest, Keisha was released on her own recognizance. The initial charges were still pending, a heavy cloud hanging over her, but Sergeant Davis's intervention had clearly put a brake on the system's momentum. He had elevated the case from a routine arrest to a matter requiring administrative scrutiny. As soon as she was out, her first call wasn't to a lawyer, it was to her own commanding officer in the Metro IA unit, Captain Eva Rostova. She met Rostova in a nondescript coffee shop miles away from the suburban precinct, the conversation held in low, urgent tones. "They processed me under my cover ID," Keisha explained, sipping a black coffee. My prints won't flag in the system unless they run them through a much deeper federal database, which they won't for these kinds of charges. My cover is still intact for now, but they have my picture. Captain Rostova, a woman with a formidable reputation and an unwavering commitment to rooting out corruption, listened intently. And Carter? And the detectives? Carter manufactured the whole thing, Keisha said. Pure escalation based on prejudice. The detectives, Miller and Rossi, just tried to steamroll me into confirming his story. The only person who showed an ounce of integrity was the watch commander, Sergeant Davis. Rostova nodded, her expression grim. Davis has a good reputation. He's clean. His flagging the file is our way in. We can't have Metro IA just swoop in. It'll tip our hand on the larger investigation. But as Keisha Johnson, citizen, you have every right to file a formal complaint against Carter. That will trigger their own internal affairs process. It forces their hand. They'll have no choice but to pull the body camera footage and conduct a formal review. And I'll be at the center of it, Keisha said. It's a risk. If they dig too deep into my background. We've made your cover ironclad, Rostova reassured her. They'll find a freelance graphic designer with a solid, if unremarkable, history. The key is the footage. Carter has no idea he's being investigated by one of our own. He'll assume you're just another disgruntled civilian. He'll be arrogant. He'll stand by his report. Let him. Let him dig his own grave on camera. Following Rostova's instruction, Keisha went to the precinct's headquarters the next day. She walked into the Internal Affairs office, a quiet, tense space where police officers came to be policed. She filled out the formal complaint forms, her hand steady as she detailed Officer Carter's unprofessional conduct, his baseless accusations, and his unnecessary use of force. She described his threats toward her aunt and cousin and the fabricated nature of the charges against her. Filing the complaint officially turned her from a defendant into an accuser. The system was now forced to investigate itself. The complaint landed on the desk of Lieutenant Marks, the head of the Suburban Precinct's IA unit. Marks was a by-the-book administrator, more concerned with liability and procedure than with abstract notions of justice. A complaint against a veteran officer like Carter was a headache he didn't need, but the watch commander's flag on the file meant he couldn't simply bury it. With a sigh of resignation, he opened a new case file and sent out 2 formal requests. The first was for a copy of all reports and supplemental narratives related to the arrest of Keisha Johnson. The second, and most crucial, was for the unedited body camera footage from Officer James Carter's device, from the moment he arrived on the scene until the moment Ms. Johnson was secured in his vehicle. The official machinery of an internal affairs investigation began to grind into motion. Witness lists were drawn up. Aunt May, Marcus Jones, Gus, the tow truck driver. Interview schedules were drafted. But everyone knew that the entire case would hinge on what that small, chest-mounted camera had recorded. Body cameras were a double-edged sword for police departments. They could exonerate an officer from a false accusation, but they could also serve as an undeniable, impartial witness to misconduct. Officer Carter, confident in the story he had constructed, likely believed the footage would support his version of events. He would have framed his shots, narrated his actions, and performed for the lens, creating what he thought was a justification for his actions. He had no idea that the woman he had arrested was a professional trained to see through such manipulations. The investigation had begun. The truth was sitting in a digital file on a server, waiting to be seen. Lieutenant Marks sat in his darkened office, the only light coming from the large monitor on his desk. He clicked play, and the body camera footage from Officer James Carter began. The video was shaky at first as Carter got out of his car, the audio filled with the crunch of gravel under his boots and his own heavy breathing. Marks watched as Carter approached the scene. He saw Keisha Johnson standing calmly by her car, speaking on the phone. He heard Carter's first words, not a polite inquiry, but an aggressive demand. "What's going on here?" Marks, a man who had reviewed hundreds of hours of such footage, immediately noted the officer's tone. It was confrontational from the start. He watched Keisha's reaction. She didn't rise to the bait. Her voice, captured clearly by Carter's microphone, was even and respectful. She explained the situation, a civil matter. There was no belligerence, no screaming, nothing that remotely matched the description in Carter's sworn report. He had written, "The female subject was immediately hostile and uncooperative." The video showed the exact opposite. Marks made a note. This was discrepancy number 1. The footage continued. The SUV carrying Aunt May and Marcus arrived. Carter's body language changed instantly. He bladed his stance, his hand went to his weapon. The audio captured his barked commands to "Stay back!" Marks watched as Aunt May, an older woman, tried to explain they were family. He saw the fear on Marcus's face. Carter's report described them as a hostile crowd attempting to surround and intimidate an officer. The video showed 2 concerned family members standing a good 20 feet away looking scared. This was discrepancy number 2, and it was a significant one. Marks leaned closer to the screen. He watched the interaction between Carter and Marcus. He heard Carter demand ID and order Marcus to approach slowly, his tone dripping with menace. He saw the terror in the young man's eyes. Then he saw Marcus run. Carter's report painted this as the flight of a guilty man. But watching the raw footage, understanding the context of Carter's escalating aggression, Marks saw it for what it was. The panicked reaction of a terrified kid. Crucially, the camera captured Carter's immediate pivot to Keisha, his furious, accusatory screams, "See what you did?" He was blaming her for Marcus's fear, a fear he himself had induced. The most damning portion was the arrest itself. The camera showed Keisha, though clearly upset, did not physically resist. She turned around as commanded. Carter's report detailed a struggle to secure the cuffs on the resisting suspect. The video showed Carter using unnecessary force, wrenching her arms behind her back with a violence that was disproportionate to the situation. It showed him placing his hand on her neck and pushing her into the car. Her words, "You're making a very big mistake," were not the ravings of a hysterical suspect, but the cold, clear warning of someone who was being wrongfully arrested. Marks paused the video and rubbed his tired eyes. He rewound and watched the entire sequence again. There was no ambiguity. The footage didn't just contradict Carter's report, it obliterated it. It was a frame-by-frame deconstruction of a false narrative. Carter hadn't just exaggerated, he had lied. He had created a fictional account of the events to justify an arrest that was improper from the start. His report was a work of fiction designed to protect himself from the consequences of his own prejudice and poor policing. He fast-forwarded through the transport to the station, then pulled up the video files from the precinct's interrogation room. The audio was clear. He listened to Detectives Miller and Rossi trying to coerce Keisha into confirming Carter's false report. He heard her steadfastly maintaining her version of events, the same version that he had just seen proven true by the body camera. He heard Miller mock her for knowing her rights. It was a textbook example of confirmation bias and coercive interrogation. They hadn't been investigating a crime, they had been trying to close a report. Lieutenant Marks leaned back in his chair, a grim expression on his face. This was no longer a simple complaint. This was a case of gross misconduct, falsification of an official report, and a wrongful arrest. The evidence was irrefutable. What Marks didn't know was who Keisha Johnson really was. But even without that explosive piece of information, he knew one thing for certain. Officer James Carter was in a world of trouble. The truth had been unmasked, not by a witness, but by Carter's own camera. With the body camera footage providing undeniable evidence of misconduct, Lieutenant Marks's investigation shifted. The primary question was no longer if Officer Carter had acted improperly, but why, and how deep the deception went. As part of his due diligence, Marks decided to run a more thorough background check on the complainant, Keisha Johnson. The initial check had revealed, as Captain Rostova predicted, a perfectly mundane life. A freelance graphic designer with a clean record, good credit, and a quiet rental history. It was a solid, unremarkable cover. But Marks was a thorough man. Something about Johnson's composure during the arrest, her chillingly calm statement that Carter was making a big mistake, nagged at him. It wasn't the typical response of a panicked civilian. It was the response of someone who knew things. He made a request to the state's Central Records Division for any and all information connected to Keisha Johnson's prints, flagging it for cross-referencing with law enforcement and government employee databases. It was a slightly unusual step for a civilian complaint case, but Marks trusted his gut. A few hours later, a priority email landed in his inbox. It was marked confidential, for law enforcement eyes only. Marks opened it, his brow furrowed in curiosity. His eyes scanned the first few lines and then widened in disbelief. He read the document again slowly, making sure he wasn't misinterpreting the information. He pushed his chair back from his desk and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered to the empty room. The file in front of him revealed the truth. Keisha Johnson was a ghost. The identity was a carefully constructed fiction. Her real name was Detective Imani Wallace. She was not a graphic designer. She was a highly decorated 5-year veteran of the Metro City Police Department's Internal Affairs Bureau. The file included her commendations, her service record, and a brief, heavily redacted summary of her current assignment. A deep-cover operation investigating patterns of corruption, racial bias, and excessive force in several suburban precincts, including his own. Officer James Carter hadn't just wrongfully arrested a civilian. He had arrested a fellow police officer who was actively investigating his department. The revelation hit Marks like a physical blow. The entire case was instantly transformed. This was no longer just an embarrassing incident of a bad cop losing his temper. This was a catastrophic institutional failure. Carter's actions had not only violated a citizen's rights, they had potentially compromised a major, multi-jurisdictional internal investigation. The implications were staggering. Marks picked up his phone, his hand slightly unsteady. He didn't call his own chief. This was now far above his pay grade. He dialed the number for Captain Eva Rostova, the name listed in the file as Detective Wallace's commanding officer. "Captain Rostova, this is Lieutenant Marks with the Northwood Precinct 1A, he said, his voice tense. "We need to talk. It's about a complaint filed by a woman named Keisha Johnson." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I'm familiar with Ms. Johnson," Rostova replied, her voice cool and professional. "Are you calling to inform me of the status of her complaint?" "I'm calling," Marks said, taking a deep breath, "to inform you that Officer James Carter has, in the parlance of our profession, stepped on a landmine. And I think the fallout is going to be significant. Your detective is safe, but her cover in my precinct is, as of this moment, completely blown." The conversation that followed was tense and freighted with the gravity of the situation. They spoke in the careful, coded language of law enforcement professionals discussing a sensitive matter. Rostova confirmed Wallace's identity and the nature of her assignment. Marks confirmed what the body camera footage showed. A plan was quickly formulated. This was no longer a local IA matter to be handled quietly. This was a crisis that required the immediate attention of the highest levels of both departments. The hidden identity of Keisha Johnson had come to light, and with it, the fuse had been lit on a powder keg that threatened to blow the lid off the entire precinct. The case of one wrongful arrest had just become a referendum on the department's integrity. The news of Detective Imani Wallace's, Keisha Johnson's, true identity spread through the upper echelons of the Northwood Police Department with the speed and destructive force of a wildfire. Lieutenant Marks, after his call with Captain Rostova, went directly to his own chief of police, Michael Donovan. Donovan was a political animal, a man who had built his career on managing public perception and maintaining the department's reputation. When Marks laid out the facts, the irrefutable body camera footage, the falsified report, and the explosive revelation that the victim was a Metro IA undercover agent, the color drained from the chief's face. He understood the magnitude of the disaster immediately. This wasn't just a story about a bad cop anymore. This was a story about a bad cop from his department arresting an undercover officer from another department who was investigating them for being bad cops. The optics were a nightmare. The potential for scandal was immense. It invited public ridicule, destroyed interdepartmental trust, and validated every negative stereotype about his officers. "Get Carter in here, now," Donovan ordered, his voice barely a whisper. "And Miller and Rossi. I want them in my office yesterday. Silent patrol, no sirens. I don't want anyone to see them coming." While Chief Donovan prepared for damage control, the shock waves were already hitting the squad room. Rumors began to circulate, morphing with each retelling. At first, it was just that Carter was in hot water over a bad arrest. Then, the rumor became that the woman he arrested was a lawyer or a politician's daughter. But when the truth finally leaked that she was a cop, an IA cop, a stunned silence fell over the precinct. Officers who had previously viewed Carter as a hard-charging, no-nonsense veteran suddenly looked at him with a mixture of fear and contempt. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had betrayed a fundamental, unspoken code. He had put handcuffs on one of their own. The fact that she was undercover, investigating them, added a thick layer of paranoia to the shock. Suddenly, every interaction was suspect. Who else was watching? Who was wearing a wire? The sense of camaraderie and trust, however fragile it might have been, was shattered. Carter had invited the enemy into their house, and now everyone was a potential suspect in a much larger investigation. When Carter, Miller, and Rossi were quietly summoned to the chief's office, they walked through the squad room under the intense, silent scrutiny of their colleagues. Their faces were grim. They knew they were in trouble, but they couldn't possibly have grasped the full extent of it yet. Inside the chief's office, the atmosphere was glacial. Chief Donovan, flanked by Lieutenant Marks and a city attorney who had been hastily summoned, played the body camera footage on a large screen without a word of introduction. Carter watched, his initial confidence visibly eroding with every frame. He saw his own aggression, heard his own lies. The camera that was supposed to be his shield had become his prosecutor. Miller and Rossi shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own coercive tactics in the interrogation room footage. When the video ended, Donovan turned it off and faced the three officers. "Officer Carter," the chief began, his voice dangerously calm, "would you like to amend any part of your sworn report?" Carter, his face pale, was speechless. The gap between his report and the reality on the screen was too vast to be explained away. "Detective Miller, Detective Rossi," Donovan continued, "do you still stand by your assessment that Ms. Johnson was an agitated and uncooperative suspect?" Before they could stammer a response, Donovan delivered the final, devastating blow. "The woman you arrested, Officer Carter, the woman you tried to railroad detectives, is Detective Imani Wallace of the Metro Internal Affairs Bureau." The room fell silent. The three officers looked as if they had been physically struck. The truth was so much worse than they could have imagined. This wasn't just about a complaint anymore. This was a career-ending, potentially criminal offense. The revelation had done more than just expose a single instance of misconduct. It had sent a shockwave of fear, paranoia, and existential dread through the entire department, from the top brass to the patrol officers on the street. The name Keisha Johnson was no longer a case file number. It was a symbol of a reckoning that had just begun. Confronted with the two immutable facts, the damning body camera footage and the true identity of his accuser, Officer James Carter's world imploded. The foundation of arrogance and authority upon which he had built his career was reduced to rubble in the chief's sterile office. His first instinct was denial, a desperate attempt to reshape reality to fit his narrative. "She never identified herself as an officer," he stammered, looking at Chief Donovan with pleading eyes. "If I had known she was a cop, the situation would have been handled completely differently." The city attorney, a sharp woman named Helen Shaw, cut him off before the chief could respond. "Officer Carter, are you suggesting that your adherence to protocol and a citizen's constitutional rights is dependent on their profession?" she asked, her voice laced with ice. Are you admitting that you treat police officers differently than the general public you are sworn to protect? Carter recoiled as if burned. He had walked directly into a legal and ethical minefield. He was inadvertently confessing to a two-tiered system of justice, a fatal admission for any police officer, especially in a formal inquiry. His defense was actually an indictment of his own character. His next attempt was to shift the blame. The situation was escalating, he insisted, his voice gaining a desperate edge. The suspect's cousin fled the scene. That's a high-stress indicator. I had to assume the worst. I was acting based on my training and experience to secure a potentially volatile scene. Lieutenant Marks, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Your camera shows you escalating the scene, Carter, he said, his tone one of cold disappointment. It shows you threatening an elderly woman and intimidating her nephew until he fled in fear. Your experience seems to have led you to manufacture a crisis where none existed. The only volatility on that scene was yours. Every avenue of defense Carter tried to construct was a dead end, blocked by the unassailable evidence of the video. He tried to claim Keisha, Detective Wallace, was verbally abusive, but the audio track proved she was firm but respectful until he threatened her family. He tried to argue she was physically resistant during the arrest, but the footage showed her reluctant compliance. His lies were being exposed in real time, not by testimony, but by his own recordings. Miller and Rossi, seeing the direction things were headed, began to distance themselves from Carter. We were acting on the information provided in Officer Carter's initial report, Miller said carefully. Our role was to interview the suspect based on the probable cause established at the scene. It was a weak, bureaucratic defense, an attempt to hide behind procedure, but it was a clear signal that they were abandoning him. They were cutting him loose to save themselves. Carter, feeling the walls closing in, made one last pathetic plea. He tried to paint himself as the victim. She was testing me, he said, his voice cracking. It was an entrapment. She wanted me to react. This whole thing was a setup by IA to make us look bad. Chief Donovan, who had been listening with a stony expression, finally erupted. A setup? He roared, slamming his hand on his desk. She was sitting in a holding cell for 6 hours, Carter. You fabricated a sworn police report. You arrested a fellow officer who was doing her job, a job that involves rooting out people like you. And you have the audacity to claim you're the victim? You are a disgrace to this uniform. You are a liability to this department and this city. The chief's rage filled the room, silencing any further protest from Carter. His desperate defense had completely crumbled. Stripped of his authority, his lies exposed, and abandoned by his colleagues, James Carter was left with nothing. He had been so confident in his ability to control the narrative, so certain that his badge gave him the power to define reality. But he had come up against a truth that could not be bullied, intimidated, or lied away. The interrogation was over. There were no more questions to be asked. There was only the inevitable, crushing weight of the consequences. In the aftermath of the disastrous meeting, Chief Michael Donovan knew that passive damage control was not enough. The situation with Officer Carter and Detective Wallace was a cancer within his department, and it required aggressive, decisive surgery. Anything less would be seen as a cover-up, confirming the public's worst suspicions about police accountability and potentially triggering a full-scale investigation by the Department of Justice. His political instincts, honed over decades, told him that the only way to survive this crisis was to get out in front of it, to be the one leading the charge for justice, not the one reacting to it. The following morning, Donovan called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters from every local news outlet and several national ones. The buzz of speculation was palpable. Chief Donovan, flanked by a somber Lieutenant Marks and the city attorney, stepped up to the podium. He looked haggard but resolute. He didn't begin with vague platitudes or bureaucratic jargon. He began with an apology. Yesterday, a member of our community was wrongfully arrested by an officer of this department, Donovan said, his voice steady and clear. The officer's conduct was unprofessional, unacceptable, and is not representative of the values of the Northwood Police Department. On behalf of the department, I want to offer my deepest and most sincere apologies to the victim of this incident." He then laid out the facts of the case, careful not to compromise the ongoing internal process, but providing enough detail to show the seriousness of the situation. He described how Officer Carter had escalated a routine civil matter, how he had falsified his official report, and how an internal review, prompted by the diligence of a watch commander, had uncovered the truth. As a result of this preliminary investigation, Donovan announced, Officer James Carter has been suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending the outcome of a formal disciplinary hearing. His badge and service weapon have been confiscated. Furthermore, Detectives Miller and Rossi have been placed on administrative desk duty, pending a review of their role in the subsequent investigation. The reporters erupted with questions, but Donovan held up a hand for silence. He had one more bombshell to drop. The victim in this case, he continued, his expression grim, was later identified as a decorated undercover law enforcement officer from another agency. While her identity is confidential, I can say that her arrest was not only an injustice to a citizen, but a profound breach of professional trust that has endangered crucial investigative work. This revelation sent a new shockwave through the room. The story was now infinitely more significant. It wasn't just a case of a bad cop, it was a systemic failure of epic proportions. Donovan's strategy was clear and bold. By publicly condemning Carter's actions and taking immediate visible disciplinary steps, he was positioning himself and his department on the side of accountability. He was signaling to the public, to other law enforcement agencies, and, most importantly, to his own officers, that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. He was sacrificing one of his own veteran officers to save the reputation of the institution. "Let me be unequivocal," Donovan concluded, looking directly into the cameras. "There is no room for prejudice, dishonesty, or abuse of power in the Northwood Police Department. We will hold ourselves to the highest possible standard. We will cooperate fully with the Metro IA's ongoing investigations. We will be transparent, and we will ensure that justice is served. This is not just a promise. It is my unwavering commitment." The press conference was a calculated risk, but it was a necessary one. It set a new tone for the entire affair. The chief's public and unequivocal stand for justice transformed the narrative. It was no longer just Keisha Johnson's or Detective Wallace's fight. The chief of police himself had drawn a line in the sand, declaring that Officer Carter's actions were an intolerable stain on the badge. It was a turning point, a clear signal that the system, at least from the very top, would not protect Carter. His fate was all but sealed. The formal disciplinary hearing that followed was less a trial and more a formality. The evidence against Officer James Carter was so overwhelming that the outcome was never in doubt. The internal disciplinary board, composed of 2 high-ranking police captains and a civilian oversight representative, reviewed the case file in its entirety. They watched the body camera footage, which played in the silent hearing room like a short film about the abuse of power. They read Carter's initial report and then read Lieutenant Marks's meticulous, point-by-point refutation of it. They reviewed the statements from a deeply apologetic Gus, the tow truck driver, a traumatized Marcus Jones, and a dignified Aunt May. Carter was present, represented by his police union lawyer. He sat stone-faced, his career dissolving before his eyes. His lawyer attempted a few half-hearted defenses, arguing that Carter's long service record should be taken into account, that it was a high-stress situation, a lapse in judgment rather than an act of malice. But these arguments evaporated in the harsh, objective light of the video evidence. The footage showed clear, deliberate escalation. The falsified report showed a conscious effort to deceive. There was no lapse in judgment that could explain the sheer breadth of his misconduct. Detective Imani Wallace was not required to attend. Her statement, submitted through Captain Rostova, was read into the record. It was a professional, dispassionate account of the events, detailing how Carter's actions deviated from standard police procedure at every turn. It was the analysis of an expert witness, not the emotional plea of a victim, which made it all the more damning. The board deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was unanimous. The board chairman, a stern, old-school captain on the verge of retirement, read the findings aloud. The board finds that Officer James Carter is guilty of gross misconduct, including but not limited to the falsification of an official report, abuse of authority, harassment, and conducting a wrongful arrest. His actions have brought discredit to himself and to this department. They represent a flagrant violation of his oath of office and the public trust. The chairman paused, looking directly at Carter. Effective immediately, your employment with the Northwood Police Department is terminated. You are hereby dishonorably discharged. The words hung in the air. Terminated. Dishonorably discharged. It was the professional equivalent of a death sentence. Carter's pension was gone. His ability to work in law enforcement ever again was gone. His identity as a police officer, which had defined his life for over 2 decades, was stripped away in an instant. He showed no emotion, simply staring at the table in front of him. Detectives Miller and Rossi received a less severe but still significant punishment. They were found guilty of conducting a poor investigation and showing confirmation bias. They were suspended for 30 days without pay and would be permanently reassigned from the Detective Bureau back to uniformed patrol. Their careers as investigators were over. The verdict sent a clear and unambiguous message throughout the department. The old ways of doing things were no longer acceptable. The blue wall of silence had been breached. An officer had been held accountable not just for his actions, but for his lies. Chief Donovan's public stance had been backed by decisive internal action. It was a victory, not just for Imani Wallace, but for the principle of accountability itself. It wouldn't fix the systemic issues overnight, but it was a start. It was proof that, at least in this one instance, the system designed to police the police had actually worked. The gavel had fallen, and it had fallen on the side of justice. While the internal disciplinary process provided a measure of professional accountability, it did not address the personal and emotional toll of the ordeal on Detective Imani Wallace. The wrongful arrest, the humiliation of being handcuffed, the gaslighting in the interrogation room, and the potential compromise of a year-long undercover operation had inflicted significant damage. To address this, Imani, with the full backing of the Metro City Police Department and represented by the city's top litigators, filed a civil lawsuit against James Carter personally and the Northwood Police Department for emotional distress, defamation, and the violation of her civil rights. The Northwood City Council, facing an unwinnable case backed by irrefutable video evidence and the testimony of a fellow law enforcement officer, quickly moved to settle. They knew a jury trial would be a public relations catastrophe, a drawn-out spectacle that would air all the department's dirty laundry and likely result in an even larger financial judgment. The negotiations were swift. The city's lawyers knew they had no leverage. The only question was the amount. Imani's lawyers argued that the damages were not just about a few hours of wrongful imprisonment. They were about the deep-seated psychological impact of being betrayed by the very system she had sworn to uphold. It was about the chilling message Carter's actions sent to every person of color in the community, that their rights were conditional, that their families could be perceived as a threat, that their pleas for transparency could be twisted into accusations of incitement. They argued that a significant financial penalty was the only language some institutions understood, the only effective deterrent against future misconduct. The final settlement was historic for the region. The city of Northwood and James Carter were jointly ordered to pay Detective Imani Wallace the sum of $5 million. A significant portion of Carter's liability would be covered by the city's insurance, but a portion of it, as stipulated in the agreement, had to come from his own personal assets, including the liquidation of his police pension, which he had forfeited upon his dismissal. The settlement was not just compensatory, it was punitive. It was designed to ensure that James Carter would feel the financial consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. The news of the $5 million settlement made headlines across the country. It became a case study in police accountability, a stark example of the high price of injustice. For Imani, the money was never the primary objective. It was a tool, a means of forcing a tangible consequence. It was a public acknowledgement of the profound wrong that had been done to her. It was a number that represented the value the legal system placed on her dignity, her freedom, and her emotional well-being. She stood with Captain Rostova on a bluff overlooking the city, the settlement papers having been finalized that morning. "It's over," Rostova said quietly. "He's fired. The city paid. You won." Imani watched the cars moving on the freeways below, tiny streams of light in the vast urban landscape. "Did I?" she asked, her voice tinged with weariness. "Carter is one officer. How many more like him are out there? This doesn't fix the mindset that led him to see my family as a threat in the first place." "No, it doesn't," Rostova admitted. "But it puts every single one of them on notice. It tells them there's a price to pay, a very high price. You've created a deterrent, Imani. You've armed future victims with a precedent. That's a victory." Imani considered her words. The money would likely go to community outreach programs and civil rights advocacy groups. She had no interest in keeping it for herself. The true value was in the message it sent. The price of injustice, in this case, was $5 million. It was a number that would echo in the halls of every police precinct, a constant reminder of the day a routine vehicle seizure turned into a landmark case, all because one officer could not see past his own prejudice. The settlement was finalized, the headlines faded, and the Northwood Police Department began the arduous process of rebuilding its shattered reputation. For Detective Imani Wallace, however, the end of the legal battles did not mean the end of the journey. The experience had left an indelible mark on her. She had gone undercover to fight a war against corruption from within, but she had ended up fighting a far more personal battle on a quiet suburban street, a battle that laid bare the raw, ugly face of systemic bias. She was vindicated, but she was also wounded. She took a leave of absence from the police force. The thought of putting on a uniform, even her own, felt complicated. She had seen with terrifying clarity how that uniform could be used as a weapon of oppression, how the authority it represented could be so easily corrupted by one man's ego and prejudice. She needed time to reconcile the two sides of her life, the dedicated officer committed to justice and the black woman who had been unjustly targeted by that same system. She spent her days not in quiet reflection, but in action. Using a portion of the settlement funds, she established a small community foundation called the Marcus Project, named for her cousin. Its mission was simple: to educate young people, particularly young men of color, on how to safely navigate police encounters. They ran workshops on knowing your rights, on de-escalation techniques, and on how to use technology to safely document interactions. It was her way of transforming her trauma into a tool for empowerment, of ensuring that what happened to Marcus, his panicked flight born of pure terror, would happen to fewer people. Her own story, initially kept confidential, became a powerful part of her advocacy. She eventually decided to speak publicly, not as Detective Wallace, but as Keisha Johnson. She told the story of that afternoon, of the call for transparency, of an officer's manufactured rage, and of the click of handcuffs. She became a voice for the countless individuals whose similar stories were never validated by body camera footage or a landmark settlement. She spoke not with bitterness, but with a fierce, focused passion. She was a warrior, wounded but not broken, who had chosen to fight on a different battlefield. One afternoon, months later, Sergeant Davis, the watch commander who had first flagged her case, reached out to her. They met for coffee. Two cops from different worlds, united by a shared belief in what the badge was supposed to stand for. "I've thought a lot about that day," Davis said, stirring his coffee. "What Carter did was wrong. But the bigger problem is that for too long, guys like him were protected. Their reports were taken as gospel. What you did, you forced the whole system to look in the mirror. It's changing things here, slowly, but it's changing. Imani knew he was right. Her ordeal had been a catalyst. Chief Donovan, true to his word, had implemented new mandatory de-escalation and implicit bias training. The department's policy on reviewing body camera footage after any use of force or contentious arrest was now one of the strictest in the state. Her single traumatic experience had become a fulcrum for genuine institutional change. She had not only exposed a corrupt officer, but had also inadvertently forced a moment of reckoning upon an entire department. As she drove away from the coffee shop, Imani felt a sense of peace that had long eluded her. The scars of that day would always be there, a reminder of the fragility of justice. But they were no longer just symbols of a wound. They were symbols of a battle fought and won. She was a survivor, an advocate, a change-maker. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city, but for Imani Wallace, it felt like a new dawn. She had faced the darkness in her own profession and had emerged not unscathed, but stronger, with a renewed and redefined sense of purpose. Her fight was far from over, but she was ready for the next chapter. The city lights twinkled below, a sprawling galaxy of human endeavor, each light a home, a story, a life. Imani stood on that same bluff, but the feeling was different now. The weariness had been replaced by a quiet strength, a sense of settled purpose. She thought of James Carter, not with hatred, but with a kind of clinical pity. What leads a man to see a threat where there is only a family? What brokenness inside him requires the world to be an endless series of challenges to his authority? Perhaps Carter's wrongdoing wasn't born from a single monstrous source, but from 1,000 tiny cuts of resentment and fear cultivated over a 20-year career. If he had ever been an idealist, that idealism had long since curdled into cynicism. He likely saw the community he policed not as people to protect, but as a hostile population to be managed. If only he could have seen Keisha Johnson not as a female subject, but as a woman concerned about her property. If only he could have heard her request for family not as a call for backup, but as a plea for comfort. If a system hadn't insulated him from accountability for so long, perhaps his prejudices wouldn't have festered into such aggressive, destructive action. His need for absolute control was a symptom of his own profound powerlessness, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world he no longer understood or respected. Imani knew she couldn't change men like Carter, but she could help build a world that was more resilient to them. To protect herself and others like her, the path forward wasn't about vengeance, it was about vigilance. It was about building systems of transparency so powerful that the shadows in which prejudice thrives could no longer exist. If body cameras were reviewed after every contentious stop, if civilian oversight boards had real teeth, if officers knew with certainty that a lie on a report would be exposed, the cost of giving in to one's worst impulses would become too high. The answer was not to fear the system, but to relentlessly hold it to its own highest ideals. The story of Keisha Johnson is a testament to the fact that a single voice, armed with the truth, can indeed challenge a mountain of injustice. It is a reminder that the fight for freedom and fairness is waged not only in courtrooms and state houses, but on quiet suburban streets, in tense traffic stops, and in the simple, brave act of calling your family to come and bear witness. What would you have done if you were in Keisha's shoes that afternoon? How can we, as a community, better support those who seek transparency and accountability in their interactions with law enforcement? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in this ongoing conversation.